Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Rob Lunder from the Edge by Ascential Marketing Department. A few housekeeping items before we begin. All participants will be on mute for this call. If you have any questions, please enter, please enter them into the Q&A box located on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll do our very best at the end of the presentation to answer as many questions as time allows. Today's webcast is brought to you by Edge, formerly BrandView, Clavis Insight, One Click Retail, and PlanetRetail R&G. Our four companies have joined forces under Ascential PLC with a shared vision to empower brands and retailers with the most comprehensive, accurate, actionable insights and advisory solutions to grow revenue in an e-commerce driven marketplace. We partner globally with the world's leading brands and retailers to identify strategies and to provide weekly, daily, and real-time digital shelf performance KPIs including pricing, promotions, availability, traffic, conversion, sales, and share. You can learn more by visiting essentialedge.com. I'm pleased today to introduce today's speakers and my colleagues Taylor Smith and Doug Kuntz. Taylor Smith is a partner with BCG based in New York. He has been with BCG since 2005 and focuses on the consumer packaged goods sector. He works with BCG's clients to shape and implement value maximizing strategies, including growth, both organic and inorganic, sales and marketing, digital advanced analytics, and operations. Taylor leads BCG's work in digital, AI, and advanced analytics for the CPG sector. We are happy to welcome him here today. Also speaking today is Doug Kuntz. Doug is the Director of Content Strategy and Analytics for Edge, leading the organization's global content strategy. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Taylor, who will kick off today's webcast.
Thanks, Rob. Hopefully many of you are familiar with BCG or have had the opportunity to work with us at some point in your career. But for those of you who aren't familiar, just a quick primer on who BCG is. We're a leading management consulting firm. We have a truly global presence. As you can see on the slide, we have now over 85 offices in nearly 50 countries, over 17,000 employees, and over $7 billion in revenue. We're probably best known for helping companies tackle really tough strategic questions at the C-suite level. And we also bring deep functional expertise in sales and marketing, supply chain and operations, people and organization, data science, and technology. From an industry perspective, consumer and retail work is really core to BCG. It's one of our largest global practices. We have over 250 partners around the world, like myself, serving consumer and retail clients. And we're very happy to have the opportunity to partner with Edge today on this webcast. Rob, if you want to go to the next slide. Today in my part of the presentation, I want to make a renewed call to action for CPG manufacturers. E-commerce, it remains a small % of total sales for most large CPG companies, but it is driving a huge share of the overall growth in terms of dollars across CPG sectors. And even though large CPG companies and our clients have made investments and built teams, built capabilities over the past 3 to 5 years, they generally remain behind the curve and missing out on the full opportunity. There's market share gaps online versus their brick and mortar share positions. Many categories remain underdeveloped online relative to brick and mortar, and a lack of supply chain flexibility or a lack of some other capabilities are causing missed sales and lost demand opportunities. And as the channel grows bigger, it is increasingly expensive to miss these opportunities from a sales perspective. And it's also increasingly expensive to invest in catching up based on some of the capabilities that are required to really be successful in the channel. So today I'm going to talk about 4 steps that CPG executive teams need to take to really go all in on the opportunity. And then I think Doug will build on that to talk about organization, data and analytics platforms that can help with success. Rob, you can move to the next one. Look, at this point, it should be pretty obvious that online retail is a big deal across every category, not just consumer goods. This week in the U.S., Cyber Monday sales were nearly $8 billion. Online holiday sales are going to be $100 billion or more based on what retail analysts are forecasting. earlier this month in China, Alibaba's Singles Day did over 30 billion of sales in one day. I mean, these are huge, huge numbers. And if you look at the CPG industry on this slide, and here we're looking at, for our purposes, a U.S.-centric view that includes food and beverage, cosmetics, households, and personal care. You know, trips are increasingly moving online. We see that the overall sector, while it continues to grow slowly at 1 or 2%, and part of that's due to the competitive pressure and deflationary pressures driven by Amazon, driven by Walmart, and other retailers that are working to stay competitive. Online is relatively small. It's only 5% of CPG, but it's fast growing. And if you think about it in dollar terms, not just percentage growth terms, but dollar terms, we expect half the growth or more over the next 5 years in the sector is coming from e-commerce growth. So the bottom line is, if you're not getting your fair share or better in e-commerce, it's really tough to grow at or ahead of the market, which is the ambition for most brands and most companies. Okay, let's move to the next one. So if getting your fair share is an imperative, if you hope to drive overall growth, unfortunately, most large CPGs are not getting their fair share based on the analysis we've done and what we see across our clients. You know, as many of you know, the winning brands in e-commerce, especially on the marketplace platforms like Amazon or Tmall, are not necessarily the same brands that have been winning in brick and mortar historically. In the U.S., Amazon, which is over, you know, depending on which estimates you look at, over 45% of all e-commerce sales, you know, there's a number of characteristics, well-documented characteristics, which make it tough for incumbent CPG players to get their fair share relative to brick and mortar. You know, first, the infinite shelf, which eliminates barriers to entry and provides new competitors with a platform to market and distribute products. Second, you know, the consumer shopping missions and behaviors are very different on Amazon versus what you find in a typical supermarket or mass merchant store. You know, people buying 1, 2 items at a time. They're not walking the aisles. They're spear fishing for specific items. And third, you know, you have shipping economics to worry about when it comes to prices and pack sizes, given the model and given the basket size. On this page, you just see a simple analysis, you know, with a few example categories. On the left, you have the best-selling retail brands based on market share across these categories: chocolate, cosmetics, snacks. On the right, over the last month, the top sellers on Amazon. You can see some surprising names on there. You know, in chocolate, just as one example, Hershey and Mars brands top the list on the left. Those are the traditional share leaders. On Amazon, on the right, you have Choc Zero as the #1 seller over the last month, which is a sugar-free, paleo, diet-friendly chocolate brand with almost zero brick-and-mortar presence or market share as the top seller. So, you know, it's a place where smaller niche brands, digital native brands can find success. There are a lot of examples of that. And increasingly, you know, brands which are building a presence online and then working to shift that offline. And many of our clients view that as a threat. So let's go to the next slide. So what does this mean for large CPG companies? I think we shouldn't view it as a threat. We should view it as our opportunity. You know, on this page, we have an imperfect market share comparison of online and offline, but I think still illustrative. So what you see here is on the offline column, the IRI measured brick and mortar market shares of the top manufacturers. In the online column, you've got the share of those same manufacturers of Amazon's top 50 items. And yes, you know, it's true, the gaps at Amazon are typically larger than the gaps we'd find at a grocery.com site or brickandmortar.com site. And yes, this may overstate it because it's share of top 50 items versus true market share. But the point is, even a few share points gap is worth hundreds of millions of dollars of opportunity. And there's a lot of opportunities to execute better with existing brands to close those share gaps. There's a lot of opportunities to build and develop the overall categories online, meeting needs of specific consumer segments. And there's also opportunities to drive incremental category and brand growth by innovating different consumer needs, appealing to very specific consumer segments with product or pack or flavor variations that you can't do or are much harder to do in a limited shelf set brick and mortar environment. Chalk Zero being a good example of that. If we go to the next slide here, this just brings us to how we think about large CPGs needing to react in order to prepare to fight and fully capitalize on the opportunity. And I think with the audience we have on this webcast, I'm probably preaching to the choir here about the importance of this stuff, but I find that a lot of C-suite executives still don't fully get it and are still moving too slowly and too tentatively in many cases to shift resources and shift investments to fully take advantage of it. So just to set up the framework, and then I'll go through them each in some detail. But first, you really need to understand the range of retail environments that exist today in e-commerce and develop differentiated strategies and capabilities to compete in each. The second one, a laser focus on driving traffic and conversion metrics, leveraging data and analytics to improve execution, which I know Doug will talk more about in a few minutes. Third, you need a supply chain that is reliable, maximizing availability, and ideally flexible enough to pursue unique online demand opportunities. And then fourth, the organization has to be wired for success, which I'll talk about for a bit, and Doug will build on as well. If we take these in turn, and go a bit deeper, matching the strategy to the e-commerce environment, hopefully it's obvious to everyone on this webcast that e-commerce is not monolithic. There are different types of platforms, different models. You need different strategies to compete and win on each one. In the US, a lot of C-suite executives are fixated on Amazon, given that it represents over 40% of the e-commerce market and requires such different capabilities to be successful. And obviously that's critically important. But that also leaves another 50 or 60% of the opportunity on the table where there's also an opportunity to optimize. And you have to ask yourself, as a company or as a brand, are you really resourced to maximize the opportunities in the other 60%? You have brick-and-mortar.com sites, Walmart.com, Target.com, Kroger.com, et cetera. You have pure plays like FreshDirect, Box.com. You have B2B platform opportunities. All of these are huge opportunities that are often underinvested and not getting the resources and attention relative to the Amazon opportunity. From an assortment strategy perspective, there's some basics to understand about each model. Is it a marketplace model or a limited assortment model? What is the shopper mission? Is it spearfishing one or two items, or is it a full grocery basket stock-up trip? Or is it impulse, kind of quick delivery? And then given the basket size and given the model, do you have to worry about the shipping economics of the basket or of a single item? And your assortment strategy is obviously going to differ then depending on the model and which shopper missions are going to be fulfilled. On Amazon, variety matters a lot. You can try new pack sizes, new flavors. You can think about price points and packs that work given a one or two item basket. On grocery.com, limited assortment model, stock up behavior, something closer to your traditional brick and mortar assortment is going to work better generally. On B2B platforms, your food service offers, your club packs, your C-store cases. I think the Edge team, some of the analytics I've seen from them indicate you can get a 5 to 15% uplift or more based on optimizing assortment alone. And then obviously based on which model you're looking at, your merchandising tactics also need to fit the model and fit the strategy. At Amazon, you need to win the search rankings. At grocery.com, where the consumer behavior is often more list-driven and routine-driven, how do you become part of that list and that regular stock-up on a single click? And then finally, the brand building strategies are also very different by model and by platform. You have to tailor your programs to what the e-commerce platform or retailer has available and what end consumer data they have available or make available to you from a marketing perspective. The second pillar here, driving online traffic and conversion. it creates a virtuous circle, right? Consumers search, they find and buy your product, they write reviews. The more that happens, the better your search ranking, the more reviews get written, and so on. Getting on the first page of search results is incredibly important. Even though Amazon's got the infinite shelf, 50% or more of the sales in any category go to items on the top 20 search results on the first page. So what does that require? To drive traffic, and Doug will talk more about this, product content and descriptions that match up to the most highly searched terms and needs, reviews, especially favorable reviews, and then of course you can buy traffic using merchandising and marketing tactics. And I would encourage executives, right, there's an incentive to lean in early here to move up the rankings, because the further you fall behind and the more time you waste at the bottom of the rankings, the more expensive it can become to play catch up, to pay for traffic and pay for marketing programs to move back up. To drive conversion, you need great content, compelling product descriptions, high-res photos, ingredient information, videos that give shoppers the touch and feel. Again, the Edge guys have done a lot of work around this, looking at how much it's worth to perfect the content, can drive 5% lift or more, depending on your starting point. And of course, similar to traffic driving, a lot of great reviews are helpful for conversion by giving the shopper comfort that you've got a quality product. But to get that right requires not only the understanding of the different models from the first pillar I talked about, but also the investments in the content and merchandising strategies, and critically, the data and analytics capability to enable continuous analytics and improvement and optimization of what you're doing to grind out the execution wins. The third pillar here, availability. Look, I mean, one of the most damaging events for a company selling online is the inability to meet demand. If an item's out of stock, it's dropped from the search results, or the sale is directed to a third party. In any case, it can be worse than a stock out in brick and mortar, which is a costly event, because you've not only lost the sale, you've also effectively lost or degraded your digital shelf placement. There's a lot of complexity that goes into serving e-commerce and serving the overall channel proliferation across brick and mortar and e-commerce for any CPG company. More SKUs, different kinds of packaging, different kinds of service expectations, but companies have got to find a way to make their supply chains more flexible and responsive to meet the demand here. That requires close coordination, dedicated resource, project management, and oversight. We'll talk more about the organization model in a minute. The final piece here, adapting the organization. I see three fundamental changes here versus a traditional sales channel that CPG has built its model around. The first is you need unbelievable cross-functional coordination, not just a sales team. You need marketers, you need supply chain all working together. You need resources, you need budget, you need expertise from across the full P&L to be successful, and that has implications for the way you organize your team. The second is the analytical skill set and analytical routines for continuous measurement and execution optimization. In the old world, in the brick and mortar world, you plan the year, you watch your monthly Nielsen or IRI metrics to see how things are going. You make adjustments to your shelf set once or twice a year based on the scheduled reset dates. In e-commerce, you need to be a lot more dynamic. The data is available daily or real time. You can access and analyze the data in near real time, find insights, make adjustments, work to optimize content, tactics on a continuous basis. This is a very different capability from what most CPGs are used to. It is critical, and the data behind that is a critical currency for success. And then finally, the third element on adapting the org is a culture that encourages and rewards agility, experimentation, the fast fail mentality. Given the innovation and how quickly the e-commerce models are evolving, you need a constant test and learn approach and a team that's not afraid to make some quick mistakes to learn what works and what doesn't. I think at this point, with that set up, I'll turn it over to Doug to take it from here to talk more about capabilities and data platforms as you guys get moving on this agenda and work to take advantage of the opportunities.
Yes, thank you, Taylor. As Taylor said, my name is Doug, and the second portion of this, we are really going to be diving into a little bit about, strategically how you need to think about these challenges, but also what does success look like, and how do we start to set ourselves up for that. But before I jump into that, I just want to recap and highlight a lot of things actually Taylor touched on, but quantify and qualify for everyone how different these set of capabilities really are compared to what we're used to working with, right? The way we go to market is no longer the same. You think about just for the last 40 years plus, we would take product from a manufacturing facility, put it onto trucks, into retailer distribution centers, and then off onto Walmart shelves where we had 48 feet to work with. And that's obviously no longer the case in stores, and certainly that's not how it works online, right? We have an entirely new set of routes to market, whether that means new store formats, but probably more importantly, click and collect models, third-party pickup models, home delivery models, and a whole bunch of variations in between. And not only does e-commerce create all of these new ways we get products to our shoppers, but it also introduces new competitors because the barriers are so much lower than they were before. And so you have all of these digital native brands popping up and taking share, which I think a lot of Taylor's data really illustrated quite well. And what comes with all of this is margin issues. It's more costly to get stuff to people's homes. I think that's pretty straightforward. But again, it's also, we're working faster, we're working more dynamically, and so we have these shorter planning horizons. We're making decisions quicker, and data really needs to empower most of those decisions. And what comes with that is, of course, how complex the organization starts to look, because the route to market is no longer linear. It's this sort of networked circle where you have all of these routes in and out of different touch points internally in our organizations, but also between retailers, third parties, and CPG manufacturers. That complexity is so extreme, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, how we set up for that. And then again, when you have all of these different ways we have to go to market, the way we measure success is entirely new. And I think the industry as a whole is still working through how we evaluate success, particularly when we know how much e-commerce represents in terms of growth, but how challenging it can still be for profitability. And so as we move on and think about how the way we engage with our sales organization, Rob, if you could flip to the next slide, how we work with our sales organization, there's an entirely different operational model than we're used to, right? The terms of engagement are different. If you think about even 5 years ago, where we had e-commerce and we had bricks and mortar, historically we sit across from someone, sort of a true negotiation with a buyer, and talk about price, product placement, promotion, all these things. And we'd touch on e-commerce and probably mirror a lot of the decisions we were making there. You think about how far we've come. Any of you who work with Amazon already know how difficult it is to get in touch with a human, or at the very least, a person on the other end of the phone that's really able to help you, right? We have an air quote in quotes here, e-commerce suppliers to work with price, product, promotion, algorithm, right? But really, we're starting to optimize against software. We're starting to optimize against an algorithm, and there's already some examples of this happening in stores as well. Alibaba and JD in China are two examples where a lot of these algorithms are actually informing in-store merchandising decisions, not only the online decisions. And so if you think about where we're headed tomorrow, the human fades into the background even further. You hear this term, hands off the wheel, from Amazon, but really all it amounts to is we are going to be working more and more with algorithms that define our success. And it's an entirely different sales approach. It's an entirely different skill set. And we really need to be armed with sophistication in data and analysis to really help our teams optimize against these new ways of working. So if we move on to the next slide, where we start is, of course, strategy. And that's a lot of what Taylor talked about, right? And this can start at a broad commercial level where e-commerce teams often sit. But obviously, this comes down to e-commerce specific teams, strategy and insights teams, and kind of broadens out from there. We'll talk about those functions in just a moment. But what you're trying to decide is really where to play. Where's the growth? Where can I effectively partner? And you're picking the right markets. You're picking the right retail partners, and then you're making sure that you really understand their priorities and how the landscape is shifting, and what you ultimately have to do to partner effectively with these retail customers that, again, as Taylor pointed out, are really not all the same. Working with Walmart.com and Amazon.com are entirely different beasts. Working with Alibaba versus Rakuten in Asia are entirely different models. But of course, setting your strategy, in some sense, it's easy to talk about, right? But the devil is in the details. And so, Rob, if I ask you to flip to the next slide, what this starts to look like is there's a few areas that I'm gonna harp on here where you should really focus as you're getting up and running, or you're looking to refine where your business currently is, right? So we're going to talk about price, we're going to talk about packaging, we're talking about availability, we're going to talk about the content, some of that traffic and conversion that Taylor mentioned, and then also the organization to conclude. But I think it's pretty well established the challenges that e-commerce can represent for price, right? Here's a study from Edge Market Share. You may have formerly known them as One Click Retail, of literally just some top online SKUs and key food categories over the course of 12 months. What happened to price as they're listed online, and you can see that trend line is moving down and to the right. And obviously, that is not the ideal situation for our businesses. What happens? The easiest way to grow sales is to lower price. But what happens in this dynamic world is that gets price matched. You start to have this downward spiral of retailers price matching against one another, and before you know it, you basically have a new base price that you didn't intend to set, and you also created all sorts of channel conflict issues with all your other retail partners outside of e-commerce. And these things happen so fast, so quickly. It's so fast moving and so dynamic that really tracking starts to become an essential element of this. And a lot of these things at the very start, people can do manually or can try to do manually, but this gets really big and really vast quickly as your portfolio expands and the customers you work with online expands. And so when you think about setting up for success with price, there's a few things you can think about, right? First is setting a strategy that limits direct comparison across channels. And I'll talk about packaging in a minute. A lot of this does have to do with packaging and just having unique SKUs for different channels. But it's also about measuring and maintaining and just monitoring how your products are priced compared to competitors and how they're priced across the online landscape. Because what it allows you to do then with some of this data is to engineer effective pricing strategies and effective promotions that allow you to quantify the impact of some of these activities. And again, you can always, I won't dive into enforcing compliance in some markets. There's things like minimum advertised price where you can dive into, but really what this comes down to is having the tools to measure this and then having the in-house sophistication and expertise to act on it so that you're kind of avoiding that downward trend down and to the right. So if we move on to packaging, Rob, quick aligned to this, I talked about not being compared across channels. Here's an example of Nature Valley granola bars strategy they have for packs across channels, right? You see grocery, hypermarket, and Amazon specific SKU, what they use for convenience and discount, what they use in club. a lot of this is really difficult without e-commerce dedicated SKUs. And I appreciate every organization is in a slightly different place. Every organization, we don't all get the funding we want, but over time it becomes really difficult to drive success in this area without e-commerce dedicated SKUs. And that's not only the pack size to avoid comparison, but it's also to make your products e-commerce supply chain friendly and e-commerce supply chain compliant, right? So a lot of retailers online have particular protocols that you need to follow to avoid leaks, for example. You see some examples here on the right side of the screen, kind of shatter friendly, break friendly, leak friendly packaging. You even see frustration free packaging, ships in own container, all these things that make e-commerce operations much more efficient, because again, at the end of the day, we know we can drive volume online if we do things well, but it's also about how do we figure out how we're making money online. And a lot of these examples here help one do that. It's harder to set up specific, let's call it, measurement and monitoring in the same way you might with price or content or some of these other things. But packaging does really help drive a lot of this forward, because without it, you're really fighting uphill and kind of doing lots of workarounds that the leading brands online don't have to deal with. So the next thing I want to talk about is availability. And availability, I think Taylor nicely summarized. Being out of stock is a killer, right? Not only you see some data here in front of you. Online customers are more likely to switch if you don't have the SKU in stock. So not only might you lose that purchase, it also impacts search performance, as Taylor mentioned. But because of the nature of e-commerce, reordering it becomes a factor here, where I might just hit reorder on my cart. Well, if I didn't have this SKU and I moved to a competitor, the next time I hit reorder, it's that competitor's SKU. And so there's not only short-term implications for out of stocks, but also long-term implications for out of stocks. And so there's lots of tools out there that help you monitor these things daily. Edge happens to have one of those. You may know a business that used to be called Clavis Insight. Monitoring these things daily is really an essential part of success. And much like price, people do try to do this manually in some cases, but it becomes really hard to do that as your assortment broadens and the customers you work with online broaden, right? Beyond just managing and monitoring this and then kind of fixing the issues, or almost like playing whack-a-mole in some sense, there's also collaboration that you need with external other parts of the organization internally, right? So if I'm on the, let's call it the e-commerce sales team, am I collaborating with our marketing and branding teams to make sure I have the stock to support an upcoming promotion, right? One of the worst things you can do is run yourself out of stock because you weren't prepared for a promotion, simply because either you didn't communicate well enough or you weren't really thinking about it, right? So there's tools that can help you measure this stuff, measure not only kind of in or out of stock, but also trend lines, potential upcoming issues that really do help mitigate some of these really damaging out of stock issues, which frankly, it basically undermines all of the other work around e-commerce that you're doing to try to run a successful e-commerce business. And what it also helps you do is learn from the past, right? I can see, we just went through Black Friday and Cyber Monday. There's really good examples here from, let's say, 2017, where brands ran into issues not planning these things effectively, and that they can learn from that, having that data tracked over time, and then implement that going forward. And then as I move on to content, which is really what people see, and a lot of times many may think of it as meticulous, may think of it as busy work, but it really is the key to driving that traffic and conversion. You see some quantifiable results here. What happens with things like dropping in search rankings, things like how effective reviews and ratings are towards sales uplift, the importance of different types and quantities of content. Taylor got at this a little bit, that we talk about the endless aisle being online, but really the first page is what people buy from, and even the first couple results on the first page. And so in some sense, the shelf has almost gotten smaller for a lot of consumers. And so organic search performance is really key, right? We need content that is not only visual, but also mobile friendly, as more people buy stuff on phones and on tablets. Taylor talked a little bit about keywords and titles and the importance of those for search, right? Using characteristic, defining product descriptions in ways that shoppers would search for them, and also using all of the characters you're given. There's no reason you need a product description that only has 3 words when you can fit 15, and it's why you see some of those long, sometimes what may appear kind of clunky product titles, and it's because that helps search performance. And so from a measurement standpoint, again, you all may have been familiar what we now call Edge Digital Shelf, formerly known as Clavis Insight. This is a study from that part of our business. There are tools to help you not only monitor these things, but also improve these things, right? Because when it comes to content, more is more, meaning that the more you have, the better results you are likely to have. But the challenge with that is to do it consistently across all these different platforms that have all these different user interfaces, because you do want the brand to be represented appropriately across the online spectrum. And there's tools out there that can allow you not only to monitor and update those things really effectively. Again, this is another thing we can do manually, but it becomes really difficult as it gets broader. So not only is it about monitoring and updating, but also some really sophisticated tools to help you understand what are missed opportunities and how do we adjust content, titles, keywords, images, ratings, and reviews to take advantage of those opportunities that perhaps other SKUs in the competitive set aren't. And then finally, all of this comes together when we start talking about the organization. So Rob, if you can move to the next slide. We've kind of mocked up a center of excellence in e-commerce, and I appreciate that not everyone has these resources that they can use. That they can't build a team like this overnight, but you do see how many cross-functional teams are involved in running a successful e-commerce business. And it's not only setting up measurement and KPIs and centralized data where everyone's working off of the same plan, but it's also just making sure people are in the room, right? You'd be amazed how often supply chain people or finance people aren't included in some of these discussions that can have really damaging, lasting impacts, right? Simple things like, hey, Amazon doesn't let me sell this let's say bottle of detergent because it doesn't have the right leak-proof screw top on it. Well, if a supply chain person doesn't understand that and doesn't sort of get on board, then again, we're fighting uphill. We're fighting a battle that we don't need to fight. And so you start to see all sorts of segmentation strategies by customer. Taylor talked about retailers not monolithic, but you also see within the kind of the operational side, content, analytics, innovation, strategy, all of these teams working together to not only empower the kind of more of the customer facing teams, but then also relying on some of these support functions to really make the whole thing go around. And so there are there are typically global best practices for doing things across an organization, but there's always local adaptation required as well. And so integrated systems, integrated teams where people and information are able to talk to each other for faster decision making and better decision making is really what empowers or enables e-commerce success, I should say. So Rob, if we jump to the next slide really quickly, here's a very rudimentary grid here, but think about just in the basic things I talked about, price, pack, availability, and content. Here's all the teams we need to work with to effectively do this, right? E-commerce sales teams, online marketing teams, supply chain, oftentimes it's touching brick and mortar. And so as we as teams grow, you start to see how integrated and how broad this really gets. And so not only is collaboration required, but also responsibility and clarity of decision rights become really, really important as well, because it's really easy to end up with parallel work streams, parallel conversations, and either poor decisions being made or just inefficient activity. And so as we wrap up here, Rob, I'll ask you to move to the last slide here. Where do we start? How do we accelerate some of these initiatives? You know, some of this stuff is actually not that difficult, but it's hard to do it at scale, and it's hard to do it, and oftentimes teams need help doing it efficiently and effectively. And so setting the team, having the appropriate sponsor, having the appropriate stakeholders and leaders is really important here. But again, focusing on quick wins. These iterative improvement is what drives e-commerce. Day one does not, you're not suddenly the best seller on Amazon just by listing your product and having people magically discover it, right? Iterative improvement is the name of the game. Benchmarking versus competition and gaining ground on them or increasing your lead over them is how lots of teams are measuring themselves. Make sure that internally there are consistent KPIs and set those achievable targets so that we all know what we're acting on, what our goals are, and continue to build on that as you learn more, because that's what e-commerce is about. It's about doing, learning, iteratively improving, and doing it as fast as you possibly can. So because of the time, I'm going to stop there, and I'm actually going to turn it back to Rob. I think you mentioned at the top we have a Q&A session now, so I'll turn it to you, Rob, and you can pass it back to Taylor and myself whenever the relevant question comes in.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Doug and Taylor, for the great insights. We've now entered the Q&A portion of the program. All participants are on mute for the call, but if you have any questions, you can ask them by entering them into the Q&A box. A ton of questions came in, so very appreciative of everyone submitting their questions and a lot of interest in this. So I'll take the first question. Taylor, first question's for you. You talked about how e-commerce is not one thing, which makes a lot of sense. How then would you prioritize which e-commerce platform to invest against first?
Well, I think you have to go where the sales are. So in the U.S., for most companies, that starts with Amazon. You know, Doug showed the slide where thinking about quick wins and where can you get traction quickly. Amazon's the place to go. It's over 40% of the market. It's probably more incremental than a brick-and-mortar.com site, which can be often more substitution. So I think you got to start there. But then, you know, my point is there's another 60% of the market out there that you should be fighting to resource and invest against, because if you're not paying attention to that, you're also missing a lot.
Thank you, Taylor. Doug, question for you that just came in. Speaking of sharing and embedding, how are you seeing best-in-class organizations share data between e-commerce teams and brick-and-mortar teams?
Well, I don't think a lot are, or at least not as effectively as they should be. Because in many cases, on the retailer side, a lot of this data doesn't talk to one another. And so for brick and mortar and e-commerce teams, I think first and foremost, it's about coordination, right? We talked about some of those potential channel conflicts up front with price and packaging. The more those things can be, let's say, out in the air, but and then sort of acted on, the better. But the reality is a lot of organizations internally are actually, e-commerce versus brick and mortar teams are in many cases in conflict, right? Because it's they're splitting the same pie. A lot of times e-commerce is actually diverting dollars out of stores. And so KPIs become really important here so that everyone's working towards the same goal. And that typically has to come from organizational leadership, because if we pit e-commerce and brick and mortar teams against one another, the world is integrated, and Walmart or Target or Tesco or Alibaba or you name it doesn't really care where you buy it from, and so our organizations need to be set up and incentivized to think and work that way as well.
Thank you, Doug. A ton of questions have come in the panel. So again, thank you everybody for submitting your questions and interest. Everyone will receive the recording from today's session within 2 days. We have time for one more question. And again, we'll make sure to follow up with all additional questions that came in after today's webcast. Taylor, last question that came in for you. What is the best way to educate the CPG executive team on the importance of e-commerce?
Yeah, well, I think you need the facts, but I think also some emotional or immersive experiences are helpful. I think given the cross-functional requirements that we talked about today, it's not sufficient to have one C-level sponsor who's passionate about e-commerce, helping you drive the agenda. You really need the whole executive team on board to understand the requirements and what it takes. So that should be a CEO level discussion. It's a board level discussion at this point, I think, for most companies. So from a facts perspective, obviously the size, the growth of the market, the growth dollars, some of the stats that I shared earlier today, you can sometimes shock teams with a picture of who's winning in your category online, the share gap, shock them with a picture of how big or small the category is online relative to total grocery, for example. For some impulse categories, it's really underdeveloped. And if you've got data from the UK or France, where there's decent market data from Nielsen or IRI about the overall store relative to your category, sometimes that's eye-opening to see how small the category is relative to the overall store. And then from an emotional perspective, I've seen executive teams, forcing them to actually shop on e-commerce sites. Many executives are not doing that, taking them to visit an e-commerce retailer. If you can find a person to visit at Amazon, that's a great experience. Bringing in some digital native companies or brands to talk about what they're doing with e-commerce or social media to open teams' eyes to the possibilities. I think those kinds of things are effective in kind of building a learning agenda and opening people's eyes.
And if I could add to that, build on Taylor's point. We both touched on this a little bit. If the organization long-term believes e-commerce is a thing to be invested in, it gets more expensive the farther you fall behind, right? We talked about it in terms of search performance and content, but that's even more true of things like supply chain investments and sort of digital sophistication internally. And so waiting just basically, you kick the can down the road, but it makes the check you have to write in a couple years even bigger. And I think it's also important that people understand it's not just online, right? This touches stores. E-commerce performance influences in-store visibility. Lots of case studies of digital natives now selling in stores because of the popularity and the growth that they were able to achieve online. And so it's not, it affects their in-store business as well. And I think people don't always quite appreciate that.
Yeah. The last thing I'd add, if you have a U.S. executive who's feeling complacent or good about their place in e-commerce, show them what's happening in China. Show them some of the innovation from Alibaba, JD, and how some of that is coming to the U.S. Hopefully that gives them a kick in the pants to think about what's next.
Great. Thanks, Taylor. Thanks, Doug. That will wrap up the Q&A portion of today's session. I'd like to thank everybody who joined in on today's webcast. Also would like to thank again Taylor and Doug for taking the time to speak with everybody today. Please do take the time after today's webcast to let us know your thoughts on the content. You can also use this as a way to request more information on any of our capabilities reviewed here today. So with that, again, I'd like to thank everybody who joined us today for joining us today's webcast. And again, anybody interested, please contact us, and we look forward to speaking and working with you in the future.